This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project for the Library of Congress. Name, Wallace Story. Birthday, November 19th, 1922. He served in World War II. He achieved the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. We are recording this on November 3rd, 2012 in Spartanburg, South Carolina. I'm Will Hines, and along with me is Ben Hines, and we are conducting the interview. No relation. So, Mr. Story, how did you enlist? What was the process of you deciding you wanted to join up to the Air Force?
Well, I guess the first thing is, why was I interested in aviation? I wanted to join up.
Yes, sir.
As a boy, I loved model airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
I must have built hundreds of them. I became president of the high school class of model airplanes, and I've just always been interested.
And where did you go to high school?
I went to high school in Greenville High School in Greenville, South Carolina. Graduated in the class of 1940. The class at the French Clemson, the French foreign, the head of France after World War II, and the Versailles Treaty, as he was leaving, he said, "I feel sorry for the class of 1940." And what he meant was that he expected to be another war in the future, and he predicted the actual class that he thought would be right in the middle of it.
Wow.
And I was in that class. The one that Franklin Roosevelt said, "This generation has a rendezvous with destiny."
Mm-hmm.
So when I finished high school in 1940, the war had just started in 1939.
Mm-hmm.
Far away as far as we were concerned, young boys, the furthest thing from our mind. And then lo and behold, the Germans broke through against France, and in a little over 4 weeks they defeated France, which at the time was the greatest land power in the world. It was like the United States. That's the way countries looked at them.
Right.
The British Navy was the greatest navy in the world, so we thought that's the power. They broke through in 4 weeks and defeated the French. So that got everybody's attention. And then, as you know, Pearl Harbor. My interest in aviation, I didn't want to go in the Navy particularly. I didn't want to go in the Army.
Right.
So I decided to volunteer for the Air Force. I was at Clemson in my sophomore class. I'd gone to Clemson because of the engineering. But actually it turned out that the military training was, I think, a great thing for anyone, war or peace. And I was at Clemson, and so I hitchhiked over to Spartanburg. And at that time,
You hitchhiked over.
Everybody wore uniforms, you know, at Clemson, just like West Point.
Right.
You might not realize that Clemson furnished more officers in World War II than anybody except West Point.
Officers.
Officers.
Wow.
More officers in World War II than anybody except West Point and Texas A&M.
Well, actually, at in Clemson, at one of the living residences, there's still gun racks from the military school, and I think that's just so neat. But they furnished a lot of officers.
A lot of officers. We marched to meals every day. Marched out for taps. I mean, not for taps, but for bugle at sunset.
Yes, sir.
And reveille blew at 8 o'clock in the morning. So I had a little military background.
Yes, sir.
I came over to Spartanburg and took a bus out to Camp Croft. Camp Croft was a large military training establishment. And I never forget, I walked from the gate, which is still there, the main gate, across to where the building was I was supposed to enlist. I didn't realize you could wait for a little bus to take it, so I walked all the way across Camp Croft.
And how long was that? Was that a couple miles? Or?
Oh, it must have been at least a mile and a half. And took all the necessary tests they gave you. It was nothing like the test you were going to get later, but at least to make sure they thought you would qualify as a cadet. And joined the Air Force in August 13th, 1942. I expected to be called almost immediately
Mm-hmm.
into service. Instead, they said, no, you go back to school.
Hmm.
And you'll learn in school until we call you. You may be interested in this if you don't know it. The reason I was kept in school, well, let me back up a minute. I was kept in school until February of the next year.
43.
43.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, rather than going to flight training, they sent me to a girls' college in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. There were 300 aviation, we thought we were cadets.
Mm-hmm.
They called us aviation students at a girls' college with 600 girls. They did the same thing at Clemson later. They had people sent there for the Air Force.
Hmm.
And so instead of going to flight training, here I am at a girls' school. Now what I learned years later was what happened was the Air Force didn't have the ability to train the people they were enlisting.
Hmm.
And so what they decided to do was to get as many as they could of college people, because you had to have 2 years of college prior to this time to join the Air Force. They wanted to get as many good people as they could before they were drafted or volunteered for the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And while they were building airfields to train, they sent us to these schools as sort of a holding spot.
Hmm.
And the Air Force, which up until that time had never graduated more than about 200 pilots in a year, built flying schools all over the southeast and graduated 103,000 pilots.
103,000?
Next 2 years.
Oh my
We
God.
were just being held there.
Right.
Well, the other services found out about it
Mm-hmm.
and said, you can't do this. They went to Congress.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to let these people be released. And you know what happened?
What?
They came down to meet, or they met with James Burns from South Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
who was the assistant president. And he said it's all right to do that.
Hmm.
The Air Force can keep these people for a reasonable time as they're building facilities.
Right.
So I stayed at Kutztown, Pennsylvania for about 2 months and was then sent to flight training in Texas. We got on a train, rode all night, and ended up down in San Antonio, Texas,
Mm-hmm.
which was where people still enter the Air Force today. And that's where we were given all these tests to make sure we qualified as an aviation cadet. We spent a full week in the physical examination part of it. You can't believe the kind of physical tests they gave. You were afraid you were going to fail at any
What?
minute.
Or do you have any examples of what they did? Do you know? Do you remember any that? Any
Well,
physical
they gave
tests?
you heart tests that, you know, a boy of my age, or whatever I was, 20 years old,
Mm-hmm.
had never heard of. Well, they'd hook you up and do various heart tests
Huh.
and things of this nature. Your eye test,
Mm-hmm.
you had to be 20/20 or better,
Really?
and you had all sorts of tests that you take on your vision, aligning sticks and so forth to make sure that your depth perception was
Mhm.
good for a pilot. And so you own pins and needles.
Right.
In fact, only one person out of 10 who volunteered for the Air Force as a cadet got their wings.
Wow.
So you on edge while you were going through
Mm-hmm.
this.
Exactly.
Then you went through what they call pre-flight for 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you train in the military. People learn the military part of it, drilling and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I was made a sergeant because I knew about drilling already from Clemson, so I was the one that kind of led the platoon that I was in. And you took all types of exercise. You can't believe it. Some of these letters, if you look at them, I write home, and this was in July.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, this is the hottest place you ever saw. And I said, we're out exercising at 12 o'clock.
Oh God.
The next day I would say, you won't believe how hot this place is.
And this is in Texas, right?
In Texas, San Antonio,
There you
Texas.
go.
I I say, this place is so hot that we just collapse when we go back to the barracks. Next day I would say, this place is hot and we're running in full uniform for 2 miles.
Gosh.
So they put you through this sort of thing.
Right.
And then the worst thing was taking Morse code. You know what Morse code is?
I do.
You got to take 10 letters a minute,
Mm-hmm.
10 words a minute.
Ooh.
You know, A is dot dash, B, N is dash dot, did-dot, did dot, dot.
Mm-hmm.
You got to learn to take that 10 words a minute.
Wow.
And that scared everybody. Believe how hot this is. Everybody to death, because you're sitting in a little cubicle and you listen to this, did-dot, dot, dot,
And to pass, you have to get at least.
You have to get at least 10 words a minute to qualify.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I managed to do it. And after we finished there at pre-flight, they sent us to primary flight training in Bonham, Texas. There were schools all over Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Schools in the southeast, in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, because there's better flying weather down
Right.
here. Bonham, Texas was a very small town. It was named after James Bonham in the Alamo.
Mm-hmm.
And the people were just as nice to you as they could be. You know, at churches you'd go, they'd have socials for you, things of that nature. And that's when well, I failed to mention, up at Kutztown, you did get to have 10 hours in a Piper Cub. They didn't let you solo, but part of the time when I was up at Kutztown, you went out to Reading, to the airfield there, and you flew just as though you were learning to fly, and you did learn to fly, but they didn't let you solo
Right.
Piper Cub. So you felt you were in the Air Force while you were in this whole learning things that they wanted you to learn in the college before you went to San Antonio. So in San Antonio, we flew a PT-19. This was a single-engine, two-place plane, low wing. You sat in the front seat and instructor in the back. And you had about 6 to 8 hours. They expected you to solo, 6 to 10, something like that. I soloed at about 8 hours. And that gave you a great thrill. Well, the first time you took off by yourself.
I bet that was
I mean,
amazing
you
feeling.
really felt this is something. You went to what they called an auxiliary field. Rather than the main field, it had 3 or 4 other places, just big dirt runways. And you would practice landing there and solo from those. Most people did. And then you did a little short cross country, flying maybe 30 miles and back. And when you finished primary flight training, you advanced to basic. Now, this was a whole other world. Now you were in the military. You had military officers, not civilian people teaching you to fly, but you had military officers. And you were flying a BT-13, which is we call it the Volte Vibrate, because the canopy maybe rattled a lot. And this was at Perrin Field at Sherman, Texas. I'll tell you a little aside about that. The last flight I took with Roger Mulligan that I worked for 63 years, he and I went about 4 years ago out to Las Vegas. Phoenix, for a textile meeting. And they had big headwinds. And so the pilot said, we're going to land and fuel midway rather than going all the way. We'll fly all the way back without fuel. And we landed at Perrin Field, Texas.
Wow.
I didn't realize we were going to land there, but I got out and that was Perrin Field. It's now a big municipal county airport. But it gave me a funny feeling to land at the field that I went to all those many years ago. So you learn to fly the Volte. And here you did acrobatics. You learned how, well, you did some acrobatics in primary. You did loop and spins, snap rolls. Well, you did the same thing, but in a bigger, more powerful plane. The Volte was like a 450 horsepower engine. It didn't have a retractable landing gear, but it had variable two-position propeller. You'd either have it in takeoff or landing position. You did cross countries, and you'd fly maybe 300 miles. You'd fly 60 or 70 miles to some town, and triangle to another.
Would you land in each of these towns, or just?
We generally didn't land on those. You'd fly all the way
just
around.
Fly around them and have
That's
a
right.
course mapped out.
But you'd plan your flight the night before. Your headings, and of course in flying you're flying by visual flight rules, by looking at the ground.
Right.
Which you'd plot, you're going to come this close to Spartanburg. Spartanburg's got an elevated tank, and there's a railroad track near that tank, so you see, make sure you're on course, but it was all just dead reckoning. You also learn to fly at night, and that was quite an experience. They took us out to a satellite field, take maybe 15 or 16 people out, and you'd go out there after it got dark, so it might be 9 or 10 o'clock, and there you would sit till your turn to fly came. So you might sit there and go to sleep. They'd wake you up, it's 12 o'clock, it's your time, and you get in the plane with your instructor pilot and fly at night. Now you're talking about a different experience. In Texas, there wasn't any lights.
Yeah,
It was just pitch black.
how would you see the landmarks that you saw during the day?
You didn't see them. You'd have to fly by your artificial horizon in the airplane, an instrument that shows a little airplane that you can tell whether you're level or going up or down. But the way they would do it, you take off, and your instructor would fly around, make a landing, and your depth perception was different at night. You'd feel like you were close to the ground, you'd be higher.
Right.
We came around the first time, he said, after he made one landing, he said, all right, you take her. Story, everybody was by last name, you know, in the military. Story, you take her. So I cut back on the throttle when I thought I was pretty close to the ground, pulled back. I must have dropped high as this ceiling seemed like. He said, yeah, I gave it the gun, came around again. I said, I better do better now, you know, I'll get washed out here. So I got closer and pulled the throttle back. Still dropped about 4 feet. He said, pull over to the pylon. There was a little pylon with a light on it. I thought, oh my goodness. Pulled over to the pylon, he climbed out and said, take her around yourself. So I felt like saying, you nut? So I took off, and the way they did, they put planes in pairs and stacked them. They had a group up here circling, and a few miles away over here, a group circling, 2,000 feet below, another group circling, and 2,000 feet to the ground. And they'd call you from group one, come in, and then one plane would drop down from the group above every time they called one in. So a lot of planes in the air, but they stayed separate. So I came around by myself and set her down all right. So got to be a good night flyer. One fella came in that night, and he came in too low, and his tail hook caught the fence. Had a wire fence around this field. Pulled the fence down, and all these cows came across. So we had to pack up and go home. So you learn cross-country flying.
Right.
You learn night flying. You learned acrobatics. And of course, some guys had to go out and buzz, you know, and do stuff like that. One fella buzzed under a bridge and ran into some guy wires and got killed.
Oh, no.
Another one of my classmates got in a spin and he couldn't get out of it. So you had accidents right on. Not too many though. So that gets me through basic. Any questions?
I think you covered most of it.
I've covered it. Am I covering too much for you?
No, sir, you're doing great. I love this.
Well, I went on then from there to advanced training. You had your choice of going to single engine or multi-engine. At least they said you had the choice. And I thought about it, and I thought about, well, I like to fly fighters. But the more I thought about it, if I stayed in aviation, I figured the future would be with people who could fly bigger airplanes. And transports were going to be 2 and 4 engine planes and fighter planes. That wasn't the right kind of training. So I said, I want to go to multi-engine training. So I was sent to Houston, Texas, Ellington Field. And I never did get to see Houston, but about maybe 2 days for a couple of hours. But there we flew a twin-engine plane. You sat side by side, and the instructor would sit, I guess, on the left, you sat on the right.
And was it a lot different to fly a twin-engine plane from a single engine?
Because you had retractable landing gear, but you didn't have on the basic training.
Right.
You had 2 engines, so everything was duplicated as far as your instruments were concerned. And so there was one B-24 pilot that landed one night, was talking to us at Ellington. He said, if you can fly an AT-10, which is what this was, Beechcraft AT-10, if you can fly it, you can fly anything. He said, that's the hardest thing to taxi that he'd ever seen. It wasn't too big, see, and so with 2 engines, and powerful engines, it's easy to turn yourself too quick. You could, if you gave it too much power on one side, you just go in a circle. So you had to walk the throttles to make yourself go straight. And there you learn formation flying. We'd done some formation flying in basic, but here we learned more formation flying as a group of planes. And lots of night flying and night cross countries. I went on one night cross country I'll tell you about. By the way, some of these fellows would get in the planes like at night, like my co-pilot, another cadet, and they'd just sit over and go to sleep right as soon as you took off. I wouldn't think of going to sleep with anybody else. I wouldn't know what was going on, but half of them would just, sit there and sleep. Well, I had this fellow flying with me, I forget his name now, Stroud, I think. And we took off, and we were supposed to fly from Houston up to Nacogdoches, and back over here to Austin or something like that, and back. So we'd gone to Nacogdoches and heading towards Houston. And it looked to me like the instruments were getting sort of dim. The guy was sleeping. I'm flying along at night, see, trying to keep the plane level because it's pitch black outside. And it just seemed like it was getting dimmer and dimmer. So I woke him up, looked down. He says, yeah, they're looking dimmer to me too. Well, in a few minutes, they just were going out, pitch black.
Oh, God.
And we had a flashlight, fortunately. So I said, I'm going to head back for Houston. And it was a little light, not light, but you could make out the horizon. It was a moon or something. And so I headed straight back to Houston because Houston being a big town, you could see it for miles away with the lights.
Right.
And headed straight back to Houston. And I said, all right, I got to see if I can't get the landing gear down. Electricity. I told the guy, crank the gear down. So that little crank, and he cranked the gear. I don't know how many turns, felt like 1,000. And then you're supposed to make sure your gear's down. So we take our flashlight, and I kind of look out the window, and the flashlight goes dead too.
Oh my God.
So what I did is I went over, they had gas fires all over Houston, where the flares on top of oil wells.
Right.
I got down and made a tight turn over the flare where I could look out and see my wheel. It looked like it was down all right. So then you're supposed to buzz the towel. And when you did that, they would know somebody was up there in trouble. And next time you came by, they'd have big lights looking at you. And so the only time I did anything like this, man, I buzzed that towel, and I really got close to him. Came around again, and he flashed a green light to land. So I came in, and I'm telling you, I made the best landing I think I ever made. I thought I threw that gear might collapse. I really greased that thing in. And that was training in Houston. And then on March the 12th, 1944, I got my wing. And that was a real thrill to you when you realize only one person in 10. Didn't know it that time, but I knew a lot of people didn't show up, every once in a while. In fact, back in primary, I'll tell you one thing, Will. There was one boy that bunked above me, and we went in that night after we'd been flying, and we'd play these radios real quiet till the lights out at 10 o'clock. And we turned everything off, and I could hear the boy above sobbing, just sobbing. It washed him out that day. And he was just broken-hearted about it. So you were really proud when you finished all this training. And of course it cost a couple of $100,000 to train a pilot in World War II. We don't know telling what it cost today. My mother and father came down to see me graduate. And I always appreciated this because it was hard to travel in. I mean, you just couldn't get anywhere. They took the train and got to New Orleans. They had to wait till another train the next morning almost. They had a good part of the night to wait. No place to stay, no place to sleep. My mother slept on a table, father said. And they came to Texas. I think that's the longest trip he ever made.
Wow.
And so after you finished there, you were assigned to combat training. So I was assigned to MacDill Field at Houston, Texas.
And
MacDill Field at Florida.
And this is when you flew the Memphis Belle.
This is where I flew in training the Memphis Belle. This was B-17s.
Right.
And
now, were you assigned to B-17? Did you choose B-17 or?
no, you were just assigned.
You were assigned
to
to.
B-17.
Okay.
And the B-17, of course, was the best big bomber the United States had. The most challenging plane to fly. And looking back in retrospect, I think what they did, really, they didn't tell you, they assigned the smaller people to fly fighters and planes like that, and larger people to fly the bigger planes. Because nearly all the people that were associated with me in B-17 were at least my height. I was about 5'11" then, about 215 or something like that. And a lot of the fighter pilots were small. When I met Francis Gabreski, who was the top fighter ace in Europe, he was small. I mean, he was a whole lot shorter than I am. So the planes didn't have hydraulic boost. The B-17, so you flew it manually. Didn't have any like power steering in a car. All these planes now have power control. You didn't have that on the B-17. So you had to use more muscle in flying.
So it was pretty taxing to fly a B-17.
Yeah, particularly for hours after hours.
Oh, God.
Flying. So I go to MacDill Field, Texas. And it was nice being in Texas. Never had stayed a long time.
Still in Florida.
Huh?
Florida.
Florida. I keep getting Texas and Florida mixed up in this interview.
That's fine. So you went to MacDill Field whenever, and this was advanced combat training?
Right.
Okay. So.
And there you, of course, learn to fly the plane itself. We'd make long flights out over the Caribbean. We'd fly as far as Norfolk and across to Chicago and back down.
Oh, wow, that's a long flight.
B-17 had long range. And you learned to fly in big formations. And we'd have fighters make simulated passes at us. One thing we had to be real careful of there was the weather down in Florida. We used to sweat that out. See these big thunderheads out over the Caribbean building up during the day, and we might have to go fly. And we'd hope we didn't that night. You also had to be careful coming back. If you were out over the Caribbean flying, over the Gulf of Mexico, over the Gulf of Mexico flying, and you start coming back going 250 miles an hour, you go across Florida real quick. If you got bad weather, and you're starting to let down through that weather, if you further along than you think you are, you'll come out on the Atlantic Ocean. Not realize it. You'll think it's still the Gulf. In fact, after I was down there a few years later, there were 6 fighters, Grumman fighters, that let down like that, and they overflew flew to Florida and flew and gave out a gas. All 6 of them went down in the ocean.
Oh my gosh.
So you learn combat training, that sort of thing. And from there you were assigned to the combat area you were going to. And of course they didn't tell you where you were going. You know, I've got a book of orders. I kept every order. Once I was commissioned, you got orders directly. Before that, you were part of a group that was carried somewhere. And I put them in the order I have there, from the day I was commissioned until the day I was discharged. And it's, of course, all in military language, you know, TDY, temporary.
So you still have these orders
I
today?
got all these orders.
That's neat.
In order. And where we actually were sent was to Hunter Field in Savannah, Georgia, to pick up B-17s to go overseas. They didn't say where you were going overseas. And there was one boy, everything was alphabetical, as you know, ABC. So around me were S's, Stories, Storms, Starbird, Sinkerwood, everybody was S. And Jack Storm was a good friend of mine. He and I palled together and so forth. And he was in the same group when we were sent up to Hunter. And there they assigned you a B-17 and you took it to wherever you're supposed to go.
Now, were your gunners with you at this time? Did you?
Yeah, you had your whole crew. It was combat crew training is what they called it down in MacDill Field.
So your gunners went through their own training before?
Before they were assigned to a combat crew.
Combat crew,
While we were going through flying training, they were going through their type of training. And I didn't mention that. I had a 10-man crew. Co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, who was also the top turret gunner right behind me, radio operator, 2 waist gunners, and a tail gunner.
A ball turret gunner.
Ball turret gunner.
Yes, sir.
I will mention one thing that may have interest to you. I found my surviving crew members about 15 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Didn't know that I could. And my wife arranged a reunion we had out in Denver. We got together, it was 5 of us, still living.
Wow.
One, my engineer, was going to be there, but he called that night before he'd gotten real sick, had a heart problem, didn't get to come. But the other 4 I saw. And then I kept up with them years later. And just about 2 months ago, my tail gunner, whom I met and carried to the World War II Memorial a couple of years ago, died. He was 94 years old. But the interesting thing, Will, is what I got. I'll show it to you. I got look like a postcard. And I didn't think a thing about it. From Alan Carson, a little note. And I looked at it and it said, change of address. He said, I have had a change of address. I've gone to a much nicer place. Said, this place is the nicest place you have ever seen. Said, the streets are just clean. There's gold everywhere. He said, beautiful flowers. He says, it's just a place that you can't imagine. And he said, I'll be here from now on. It was real touching.
Yes, sir.
And then about, how long, Martha Ray? About a month
It's
ago?
2 or 3 weeks.
2 or 3
Not
weeks
more than
ago.
a month ago.
I was going to contact my navigator. We stayed in touch. And the last time I talked to him, 6 months ago, he didn't sound like himself, so I contacted his daughter to see how he was doing. She said, well, he's been in a rest home. And said, but when I'm there, we'll call you. And then the next day, I got another email that he had died. So I'm the last survivor of the 10 men that went overseas. So combat crew training is when you got that whole group together and became a cohesive group. And it's amazing. all through my training and through these, everybody that I've met were good, solid people. You know, you see so much now about people can't get along and this group and that group. They were all just kind of like me.
Right.
And you had a relationship that was different than you would ever have anywhere else. So I'm glad you mentioned that. That's the most important thing that happened in McDill is your combat crews.
Yes, sir. So you were assigned to England, right?
Well, we didn't know it at the time. We go up and went to Hunter Field, and I was telling you about Jack Storm. Turned out later when I finally contacted him after the war, just by telephone, never was able to find him. He flew a B-17 to Africa to the 50th Air Force. We were put on a train and headed somewhere. We went to New York, and what was the name of the base up there?
Fort Dix.
No, it was a base right there, Camp Kilman, which was just outside the port area. And we stayed there for about a week while we got overseas equipment issued to us. We had some nice entertainment. You've heard of the USO shows. We had a couple of Hollywood stars come in. We had, what was the name of the band? Somebody in the City Slickers. Turned out he went with us on the ship overseas, the whole band. Spike Jones and his City Slickers, kind of comedian type thing. It turned out we were put on the Aquitania. The Aquitania was a sister ship of the Mauritania and looked very much like the Lusitania, which you're probably familiar with, the four-stacker.
Yes, sir.
It was a big British ship. It was the fourth largest ship in the world at the time. And we were assigned a stateroom, the four officers, the stateroom. Enlisted men were given rooms down underneath the ship, bigger rooms, not in individual rooms. And we sailed from New York Harbor for England by ourselves, no convoy. And they said these ships were fast, so fast that they figured a submarine, unless it happened to be right on their path, would never be able to catch them. If they saw one, they couldn't catch it. And by zigzagging, the chance of it being sunk was not too great. And we were real fortunate one of them wasn't sunk, because see, the Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mary, the Aquitania, the Queen Mary carried 15,000 troops on it, whereas Norman peacetime they had 2,000. The Aquitania, I think we had about 8,000 to 10,000.
Wow.
So it was loaded down, and we headed out. We didn't know where we were going. Where we were going to North Africa or England. And I was assigned a job as an anti-submarine officer. That was interesting. You know, up on the bridge of a ship, you got two little wings that stick out where you captain, they stick out this way. I was out in one of these little wings, little open wing. And I was on 3 hours and off 3 hours, on 3 hours and off 3 hours. And my job was to stand there and be on the lookout for any kind of light. See, the ship was blacked out, everything. You couldn't have any light showing on the ship. And if I saw any kind of light, I was to tell the captain, who was just about 5, 10 feet over here at the wheel. Well, I thought, well, this is probably a mate job. They're just giving us something to do.
Right.
So I'm standing out there about 3 o'clock one night on the way, and I thought I saw a little flash of light, just momentary. I didn't know whether it was my eye, whether it was really a light, but I figured I'd better go tell the captain. So I went over and I said, sir, I said, I think, I'm not positive, but I think I saw a little prick of light off about, I told him the angle. You know what he did? He didn't say a word to me. He just turned to the guy at the wheel and said, hard starboard. And that guy turned that ship. I mean, it looked like a rowboat he turned it. So I said, well, I've got to real job. The next day I'm standing out there in the daytime, and unbeknownst to me, right behind me was a little barrier. You couldn't see right behind me. Right behind me they had these Bofors guns, these guns that a bunch of them shoot at once. They cut loose. We were just practicing. I almost jumped off the ship.
They didn't warn you at all?
No, I didn't worry, but that surprised me. You know? So I went back to my room later. Decided I'd take a bath. Had a nice stateroom. There's 4 of us in it. So I run a nice tub full of water. I get in there and I luxuriate. And I take the soap. I'm gonna soap myself. It won't soap. And I got suspicious. I taste the water, it's salt water. So yeah, I'm taking a bath in salt water. I had no way to get it off of me. I'm sticky from then until I can take a bath. Any questions?
No, sir.
Am I giving you enough detail?
You're giving me everything I need.
Well,
Definitely.
we go on, and finally after 6 days, the Queen Mary went over in 5 days. The Aquitania took 6. I got a picture of the Aquitania in one of these mini catalogs I was showing. And we got there. The ship was pointing north, and I thought we'd get right off, but they said, no, just you stay aboard. We'll get off tomorrow morning. So we woke up the next morning, the ship had been turned around. And they took us in boats to ashore. They'd given each of us a big duffel bag. We had what we call, officers had a B4 bag. It was a soft-sided bag that you could put things in. Back in those days, there wasn't any such thing. Everything was hard luggage. So this was unusual, these B4 bags. We were quite proud of them. You had a place to put everything. And then they gave you a big duffel bag to put all of your other stuff in. Anything you might have, extra shoes or blouses.
And they only gave these to the officers? Or did they give
Oh, they gave everybody one, just a big old duffel bag. It's up in the attic. They painted a stripe around each group to separate different groups. You know what color my stripe was?
What?
Naturally, orange.
Yes, sir.
Didn't know it at the time. We go ashore and here's this big stack of bags. We had to find our bags. And they had certain groups, they went certain places. They put the group I was assigned to on this English train. Now I'd been on the English train before, but you opened the door to get in like a carriage, and there was no aisle. Remember, you opened the door on either side of the train, got in, you were in that little room. You couldn't go anywhere. But it was interesting. The trains were small. Instead of having these great big couplings that our trains have, they had a little bitty one. Just put a hook, just put a hook in something, pull the next one. A little small freight train. And so we left from near Belfast, where we came in, and went down to an airfield just north of northwest of England, of London. It was where everybody was assembled before they were dispersed to the different groups. And everybody was assigned to different fields there. While I was there, I saw a buzz bomb come over. They just started attacking England with these. The buzz bomb, the British call them, or V1,
right.
was a small bomb with wings, with a little jet engine on the back. And so it gave a put-put sound. And little puffs of smoke. British called them doodlebug bugs. Bovington. That's the Bovington airfield. And I'll never forget, my navigator and I were walking around out one day, and we saw one coming over right up I guess it was about 1,500 feet over us, heading toward the field. And we watched it going over. It was still, the engine was firing. As long as it was firing, it wouldn't come down. And when it got just over our heads, it quit and started to glide down. So there was a big embankment there. I said, let's get up on the bank and see if we can see where it hits. So So we got up on this bank and we could see the thing going down, looked like it's gonna be a couple of miles away. That thing hit, it sounded like it was right by me. You never heard such an explosion. It was like 2,000 pounds of TNT.
Oh.
So the British lost almost as many people to these doodle bugs as they did in the Battle of Britain. So we stayed there for, I guess, maybe 4 days, and we were sent to our bases where we were going to be assigned. I was sent to the 384th Bomb Group at Grafton, Underwood, a little small town just outside of Kettering, England. And it looked very much like you would imagine England from reading books of long ago.
Right.
The brick streets. And the English people, I just love the English people. They were just as nice good to you as they could be. I guess it was 4 crews from Florida that were assigned to the 384th as replacement crews. And I went into the 545th Squadron. A group was made up of 48 planes at this time. There were 12 planes in a squadron. You had 3 planes in a flight. So you had the lead flight of 3 planes. You had the high element flight of 3 planes. And you had a low element of 6 planes. Call that element instead of a flight. So you had 12 planes in one squadron. And so they'd be stacked. In other words, 1, 2, 3, like that. Then you'd have another squadron stacked the same way and another one stacked the same way. So you'd have 36 airplanes all stacked. So you'd have mutual firepower between the different planes as far as German fighters. And you had another squadron so that you'd only have 3 on the mission out of the 4. The normal complement in a group was 4 squadrons of 36 planes. The B-17, we flew higher than the B-24s. Doolittle wanted the B-17. He wanted to get rid of the B-24s because they were harder to fly. They didn't fly as high. They flew lower altitude than we did. And they were more susceptible to battle damage. The wing structure, they had what's called a Davis wing. It was good from an Air Force standpoint, a long, slim wing. But it wasn't as strong as the B-17. B-17 was built like a fire plug. So it could take all kind of damage. So when you got there to the group, you had to go through more training. You go on combat crew formation practices around England. You fly around a good while before you actually went on a combat flight. We lived in Nissen huts, except when we got there, the Nissen huts were filled up. I gave my crew a tent. So about the first month, 3 weeks, we lived in a tent. We scrounged around, got some planks to make us a floor, and got us some electric light so we could have some light. And after a while, we moved into the barracks.
And how was the weather at this time?
Well, English weather is like you've always heard. It's like English weather. It's be beautiful at some time. My wife and I went over there, and we were there for 2 weeks, and it was beautiful the whole 2 weeks we were there. Didn't see hardly a cloud. Other times you can have miserable weather, on and on. And it comes right down. You can be in, I've been in London, it just be fog, drizzle. It's just typical English weather. And I wore a winter uniform all the time. You know, the blouse, you have a regular blouse, olive drab, and then you have a kind of a light summer. I always wore winter clothes. The other thing about England that most people don't realize is it's so green because of the rains they get. And everything's, you don't see any exposed dirt. Like around here you see red clay and things of that nature. It's just green. You never got dirty. You know how as a boy, under your socks, you dirty after you
Yeah.
played. You never felt dirty over it. Of course, that meant that you didn't feel like you had to take as many baths. Since you had to go to a place to bathe at night in the dark, you didn't like to do that anywhere.
Yeah.
So you went through combat training, and then you were assigned to your first mission. And I guess this would have been about, when was my first mission? Let's see, let me tell you.
So no, you got there in what? Do you remember when you got there? What month? In 1944.
Let me see. I'll just tell you here. I got there in July,
July.
and so the first mission was been just after the invasion. Invasion just happened when I got there, and we went on a mission to Gelsenkirchen, Germany. And I had an interesting thing happen here. On the first mission, they took the pilot of the plane off and put an experienced pilot on with the rest of the crew. They took the pilot and made him a co-pilot on another plane that was experienced.
So you were a co-pilot.
So I was put on as a co-pilot and another crew I didn't know. So what would happen on a mission, you didn't know whether you were going to fly or not. See, all they would say is the group is alerted. All they would say the group is stood down. That was a British term. If you were stood down, you didn't have to go on the mission the next day. If you were alerted, the group was going on a mission, but you didn't know if you were going or not. So I told my crew, I said, I'm going to be ready to fly. I don't drink or smoke. I said, I'm going to do the very best I can to get us home. And I'm not going to be out till 12 o'clock at the officers club or something and have to fly a mission at 4 o'clock. I'm going to do I expect you to do the same thing. And they did. They were a good crew. But what they would do is they'd come around and knock on your door if you were going to fly. So we lived in, by this time I was in a Nissen hut. So it'd be maybe 20 people, or maybe 3 or 4 crews in that. Well, if you were alerted, you go to sleep, and you would hear somebody come in the door. It'd wake you up.
You know it.
You'd hear a sergeant come by, and he'd tap you on the shoulder real quietly and say, Lieutenant Story, breakfast at 3 o'clock, briefing at 4. So you'd have to get up, hope you didn't wake everybody else up, get dressed, go down to breakfast, and then from breakfast you'd go to briefing. And takeoff might be at, if you say briefing was 5 o'clock, it might be 6. So I got up and go down. We briefed for this mission, Gelsenkirchen. You'd go into another Nissen hut where all the crews that were on the mission would be, nobody else. And they would have a big map, almost big as that whole wall, showing England and the continent. And they would have a red piece of tape following your route to the target, and a green piece showing your route back to Grafton Underwood. And they'd try to route it so you were missing the big anti-aircraft location, so you'd not pass over that sort of thing. They would also tell you how many gallons of gas you had and that sort of thing. First thing we'd look at, besides seeing what the target, look and see how much gas.
Right.
More gas, the longer mission it was. So Gelsenkirchen was in the Ruhr Valley. I go out, get in the plane.
And you were a co-pilot
I'm a
at this time?
co-pilot. This is the first mission.
Okay.
And they shoot a white flare. The mission is delayed for an hour because of weather or something. Well, we had already gotten in, and hooked up and everything, and you feel like you couldn't get out of the airplane with all the stuff you hooked up with it.
Right.
And so rather than getting out, we just sat there in the plane and talked. And I asked this fellow, I said, where are you from? He said, from South Carolina. I said, you are? He said, yeah. I said, where'd you go to school? He said, Clemson. So there I was, young 21-year-old boy, 20-year-old, whatever it was, in England, flying my first mission from a Clemson classmate. I thought that was real interesting.
That is awesome.
So combat missions, they were long. We flew anywhere from, I guess about the shortest mission I flew was just right across English Channel to hit Buzz bomb sites. They were shooting those towards England. And of course they were very hard to hit because they could move them around. They were just little small
They're
things.
just little moving.
But it was such a danger to the British people that they got the 8th Air Force bombing them too. We bombed those sites, which was just a short mission, maybe 5 hours or something like that. And then we flew on long missions. The longest mission I ever flew was to Stettin, almost to what was then Poland. And it was, maybe 10 hours. And you stayed sitting in the airplane flying it for 10 hours. A B-17 was not pressurized like the B-29 was. It was just whatever the atmosphere was is what it is. And we had some heat in the pilot's compartment, but the gunners, tail gunner, they had no heat. And so we flew in temperatures that were about 50 below zero. So you wore heavy underwear, heavy clothes. You also had an electrically heated flying suit. It was just like a blanket they make for houses now. That sort of thing wasn't known at the time. I think it maybe originated with the flying suits. And they had wires enmeshed in the clothes, so you got heat from there.
And were you still a little bit cold with all that stuff even? Or were you fine?
No, you were still on the cold side. But the pilots weren't as cold as the rest of the crew because they had heat in the cockpit.
Right. And they had open air too sometimes.
That's right.
Yeah. So.
Well, let's see. What would you like to know about now? That was the first mission.
So your first mission, did you just get anti-aircraft, or did you face fighters, or did you have escorts with you? That's also what I'd like to know.
Well, I'll take them one at a time. You had a flak helmet, and you had some heavily armored sections of, called it a flak suit, you put on your front here. You hook it around your neck, it was metal, came down about through your crotch. When you were going over the target, you'd put that on, put your flak hat on. Of course, I didn't know anything about this kind of stuff much. See, at the time on that first mission, I knew we had the flak suits, they were on the plane. And we started on getting ready to go on the bomb run. The engineer starts passing up the flak hats. And I pass them on to other people, All of a sudden, they're all up here, and I don't have one. I had forgotten to get a flak hat. And somebody had forgotten. And ended up, since I was the last man on the crew, everybody else took the hats, and I'm sitting here with no flak hat. All of them got flak hats on.
Oh, goodness.
And of course, flak is a term for anti-aircraft. It's a German word. And I was used to reading World War I stories about Spad fighters, these planes. Flak wasn't something you worried about.
Right.
They couldn't hit the side of a house. It was only the fighters that could do any damage. Flak was nothing. Well, we learned in a hurry. They not only had these 88 millimeter cannons that were superb. The German 88 millimeter was the best weapon on either side in the war. On the ground or in the air, as an anti-tank weapon or as an anti-aircraft. We used to say they didn't just shoot at us, they picked out which engine to shoot at. And they had two ways they would shoot at you. one just individual guns shooting at the group as it came over. See, 36 airplanes staying as tight together as they can for protection against fighters. Sometimes I'd be flying with my wing almost sticking in behind the other airplane, between the tail and the wing. Get as tight as you can. See? And that's the worst thing you do as far as flak is concerned.
Right.
Here we on this mission, and man, I start seeing this flak popping out there. It's something like you can't believe. You can see the red core of it. And they had two ways. They shoot at the individual plane. The other way is they would have barrage flak. They'd take one group of guns, maybe, I don't know the exact number, maybe 12, 16 guns, and they were all connected so they tracked together. And another group would track, another group would track. So instead of one shell bursting around you, you'd have 16 all around you. They weren't shooting at an individual plane, but they figured they would hit one because we were so close together that all these guns shooting at once, they would hit. And the 8th Air Force lost about as many planes to fighters as the flak. It was just about the same number.
Wow.
This mission that's pictured here on this picture that was given to me by the Warbird, Warbird of the Year I told you about.
Yes, sir, 2009.
2009. That mission, the 8th Air Force lost more planes to flak than any other mission. Maybe you'd like me to tell you about a few missions.
Oh, yes, sir. I'd love any examples.
Well, there's 35 missions, so I can't tell you about all of them. But I'll tell you about a few. One that was interesting was when Patton, well, let me back up. I'll tell you about one before that. You heard about the bridge too far.
Yes, sir.
Well, the Allies tried to advance and capture 3 bridges, General Montgomery and the British 8th Army. They sent us in, the 384th Gun Group, to bomb the anti-aircraft guns of all the things. Ahead of the parachute drop, where the 84th Airborne was going to drop. 82nd Airborne was going to drop. And they flew us, when we went to briefing that day, they explained that they had this big Operation Market Garden had just been launched. And that we were to fly in to bomb the anti-aircraft guns at 16,000 feet. Not 25,000 like we normally flew, but 16,000.
Where they can easily hit you.
So we were quite on the edge at that mission. And we flew, and I'll never forget the sight of, as we turned away from the target heading back, of seeing the airborne coming in dropping. C-47s for miles. C-47 was a twin-engine plane that the airborne troops used. And to see the airborne troops dropping after we had bombed and attempted to destroy a lot of the anti-aircraft. It turned out that that was a failure, as you know. They weren't able to successfully hold Arnhem, but the British, they lost about 90% of their troops that they sent in. That was a very, very costly mission. After that, when the Germans advanced, when the Americans advanced towards the Rhine, Patton asked for air support while he tried to advance across towards the Rhine River. So they decided to dispatch the 8th Air Force, my group, and others, to bomb just ahead of the 3rd Army. Now, they'd had some early drops during the invasion, where they bombed ahead of the invasion troops, and accidentally killed several hundred American troops. So we wanted to be real careful that that didn't happen again. And we really went to great extent to try to prevent it. The first thing that we did, You imagine this now, the altitude we flying at 25,000, how cold it is. We open our bomb bays way back over France. Because sometime when you open your bomb bays, you accidentally trip a bomb. You don't want to risk that. So they said, you're going to fly with your bomb bays open, all that cold air,
Oh, God.
all the way across France. They said also, when we go in, we're going to have big pieces of cloth on the ground, big as a house. They gave us a color that hopefully you can see those where the front line is. And then they said, we're going to shoot flak, red colored flak, the front line, 1,000 feet below you. So you'll see flak bursting, and you'll know that's the front line. And finally, you've got in the plane your landing, artificial landing instrument. Are you familiar with how we use those instruments?
I'm not familiar.
Well, that might intrigue you. Remind me to get back here.
Okay.
The way you flew an airplane in those days was nothing like today, where they know exactly where you are, you know where you are, you flew by eyesight. And if you flew on a range was a radio range like this, that you had a solid signal, like an N in this quadrant, and an A in this quadrant, and where they went together made a solid signal. And so here you hear did da. Over here you did da did. You could tell which one you were in. Where they went together was a solid signal. So you'd fly the range till you got to where there was a cone of silence right over the station. And you had a little map that told you that the airfield you were going to land was 10 miles that way at 270 degrees. And if you came over at 2,000 feet and took 270 degrees and let down at exactly 300 feet a minute, you have to do that manually, see. If you did that, hit that, and let down at 200 feet a minute, you'd come out at the end of the runway. And to help you do that, you had a little instrument with 2 sticks in it. And if you were on the glide path going straight, these sticks would be centered. If you got too low, this one would go up, saying you below the glide path, so you'd go up. If you got to the right, this one would go like that, telling you go to the left. So you had to keep those sticks
In the middle, right.
as you went down that glide path. If you did, you'd hit the runway. So they said, we're going to set so your instrument in the plane will dip when you pass over the front line.
Oh, wow.
And therefore, you've got flag on the ground, you've got flak, you've got this signal. We did a perfect job. We got comments from Patton and congratulating the whole 8th Air Force. It was a long mission, about a 9-hour mission.
Goodness.
The one that is depicted right here was the worst mission I was ever on. That was a mission that would bomb the oil refineries at Mercersburg. Sites was a little community right at Mercersburg. And the oil refineries were the main targets of the 8th Air Force. I don't know if you realize that or not, but there was a lot of bickering between the ground forces and the air forces about how the Air Force ought to be used.
Right.
The Air Force wanted to use it against strategic targets, figuring if you cut off the supplies the Germans had, you'd win the war. Understandably, the Army wanted to use the Air Force primarily to support the Army in close support. So there was always that dichotomy between the two. And finally, after we got pretty well across France, we concentrated on strategic targets. And the main target was oil. And the Germans knew that was the main target.
Right.
They had 1,088 guns around Merceburg. It was the most heavily defended target in Germany.
Okay.
And towards the end of the war, they didn't have any gas.
Yeah.
They didn't have gasoline for their training planes.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have gasoline for their trucks. They had horses pulling automobiles.
Yeah. Because
we had destroyed the oil refinery. Well, this mission was a mission to the biggest oil refinery, Zeiss at Merceburg.
Mm-hmm.
And we came over this target. I was leading the low element of 6 planes. And as we approached the target, with flak all around us, the lead element up here, 3 planes, I'm slightly below him like that. All of a sudden, here's a guy bailing out. It's funny how you look at something like that. Of course, I'd been on maybe 25, 28 missions by that time. But when I'm looking at the plane flying formation off of him, and the guy comes shooting back, and you think he fell out. You know, you don't think about him bailing out.
Right.
And then here comes another. Now, he's dropping and trying. You have to fall. I don't know if you realize that or not. But at 25,000, 28,000 feet, you couldn't pull your parachute.
Right.
You'd die from lack of oxygen. So you had to free fall. All the way down to about 10,000 feet. So we were told to free, and I'm going to come back and I'll tell you some other tales about this. You don't pull your chute until you fall 15,000 feet.
Oh, God.
So
and how do you know that? Is it just, you just guess, or you've had practice?
Kind of time, yes, see. You knew you fell about 120 miles an hour. See. Well, here came 4 guys out of that plane. And then the plane just kind of peeled off and went away, went down.
Mm-hmm.
About that time, my ball turret gunner calls on the intercom and says, co-pilot to pilot said, I'm being drowned in gasoline. Now that's the scariest words I could hear. Here I'm on the bomb run. And he says, gasoline's coming over his turret. And I looked out there and gas was flowing across the wing. We had had a hit, and gas was flowing across the wing, top and bottom. Now, underneath the wing of the B-17, you've got a turbo supercharger. I can show you that in a picture. Now, what the turbo supercharger is, it takes the exhaust from the engine and turns this compressor and compresses the air going into the engine. That's what allowed the B-17 to fly so high. When other planes later adopted it, but at the time, no plane could fly high like we could.
Right.
That would be cherry red. At night, if you looked out under the plane, it'd be red hot, all the milk. And here's gasoline coming on top and bottom. You can imagine how I felt. You didn't know what to say, bail out right now?
Right.
What to say, 'cause it's up to the pilot. Nobody leaves the plane unless he gives the command. That's
right.
what we were instructed, and that's what you did. You've got your fuel switches where you turn and switch off fuel. You've also got a booster pump on each engine. It boosts the pressure in the line going to that engine. So my first thought was I'll turn the booster pump off on that engine. And the booster line is separate from the main line, see. And when I turned the booster pump off, the gas stopped coming.
Ooh.
You talk about being relieved.
But did the engine stop working?
No, so you had the main line still there.
Okay.
It was just the booster line.
So the booster line was the one that was
You didn't have
damaged.
to have it on. It just didn't run as quite as well and didn't have as much pressure on the gasoline unless you boosted it.
Right.
But it was on a separate line, and fortunately that's where the hit was. And was our relief.
Yes, sir. I'm going to have to stop you real quick. I've got to change out the tape.
All right.
So,
A little too far.
Yeah.
Our son went to Clemson. His wife went to Clemson. Their son went to Clemson. And they go to, our grandson, he goes to games all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I'm thinking maybe 30 more minutes. Are you recording?
I am. I'm just taking photographs of B-17s.
Okay, well,
Are you
we
ready to
should
get
have
back
done that
to
after.
the star of the show? Okay.
Maybe 30 more minutes or however much longer.
30 minutes? Okay.
Mm-hmm. So, we were discussing your mission in that picture, and the flak, and your engine going out, and stuff.
Yeah, and I was telling you about the plane that peeled away from us.
Mm-hmm. Now, when did you face? Did you ever face any fighters? Did you ever get shot at a good bit? And
Let me tell you the rest of that, then
All
I'll
right.
ask you that. We turned away from the target.
mm-hmm.
I had stopped gas on this engine. And then about 10 minutes later, of course there are airplanes everywhere, see.
Mm-hmm.
My tail gunner called and said there's a B-17 approaching us from the rear. Now the Germans had captured a few planes that landed and didn't tear themselves up. And they would try to fly with a formation, signal how high they were and give the information.
Huh.
So you weren't sure it was one of your friends, see. I told the tail gunner to keep his eyes open. Plane pulled up. It was the plane that had dived away from us. And he pulled up in formation off my left wing. And every once in a while, his landing gear would go down, come back up. And then he'd go down, come back up. Well, we flew on back to England, and he crash landed the plane, and I found out later what had happened. They had received a hit in the oxygen tanks, which are located behind the pilot and co-pilot, kind of down on the next deck where the navigator and bombardier are. It started a fire. And the pilot told his co-pilot to go down and put the fire out. So this guy goes down and he looks and he sees the fire, and it's more than he had anticipated. And rather than doing what he should have done, nobody gave him the order to abandon ship. They didn't say anything to the pilot. He opens the hatch and bails out. The bombardier looks back and sees him bailing out, and he sees the smoke and fire, and he thinks the mission, the pilot has told him to bail out. So he bails out. The bombardier sees him. I mean, the navigator sees the bombardier. He bails out.
Oh my gosh.
Meanwhile, the pilot, because the oxygen's been hit, doesn't have any oxygen. He's still flying the plane, wondering what had happened to his people, see? And then he loses consciousness and just falls on the stick. And that's when we saw the plane just peel away. One of the waist gunners, since nobody had given any orders to do anything, he wondered what was happening. So he heads up to the front, sees the pilot, and gets him back in the seat and hooks a walk-around bottle of oxygen to his hose, resuscitates him, and the pilot flies the plane back to the base.
Oh wow.
And the oxygen was shot out, and the hydraulic system had been shot out, which controlled his landing gear. And he makes a crash landing, but brings everybody back home.
Except for the people that bailed out.
Yeah. They were in the middle of Germany
Oh my god.
and were prisoners of war.
Wow.
And this boy gets the Silver Star, the pilot. But to make matters worse, as far as I'm concerned, I won't mention any names. I bought a book about the B-17 a few years ago, and it had a picture of a pilot, explained what he did, had a picture of a co-pilot, explained what he did, had a picture of a bombardier, so forth, and this fellow's picture was in there. Explained what a pilot, and then he explains that mission and how he saved the crew.
Oh
Because
god.
when he bailed out, he said that meant the air and all came in and put the fire out, and was taking credit for having saved the crew. So you get all kinds of stories from all kind of people. Now, back to your question.
Oh, yes, sir. Did you ever face any fighters and any type of stories like that?
Well, as I say, we flew real tight formation.
Mm-hmm.
We did a whole lot better than other groups did. I've seen other groups with planes straggling, and we flew such tight formation that we were fortunate. The fighters didn't attack us as much as they did the other groups.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen them, they usually like to use head-on
Right.
fight approach. One of the worst missions we had, another group lost 14 planes to what they call I forget the name of it, a mass attack. They'd line up fighters about 8 together and come towards us head-on.
Mm-hmm.
And they lost 15 planes, another group in our wing. There's 3 groups in a wing.
God.
On this particular mission, we lost 2, which is a whole lot better than 15. I had jet fighters called out by the gunners twice.
Wow.
The Germans came out with the jets, and they merely said they saw a jet pass and they fired at him. They didn't know whether they hit him or not.
Mm-hmm.
But I was very fortunate. We had bullet holes, but
Right.
we never had anybody hurt by flak. One thing I did have happen was I was fortunate. I had regular glass in our windshield, but there was one plane that I flew that had bullet-resistant glass. It was about that thick, heavy glass. And we were on the bomb run, and flak was popping around, and I leaned up to look out towards something, and a piece of flak hit the windshield right in front of my face. It just shattered. I mean, it didn't break, but it just crazed the whole thing. I almost went through the roof.
So if that would have been regular glass, that
I was fortunate I flew that plane that day.
that was fortunate. So you did switch up. Did you fly a certain plane every mission, or you switched them up every mission, or did it just depend?
Well, I'll tell you something. I'm not sure I told my wife this. Did I tell you this the other day?
I don't know.
I was putting something together, and I can't believe what I put together. You're a mathematics man, I'm sure.
Yes, sir.
You know statistics. I flew 35 missions.
Mm-hmm.
I flew 16
Oh, yeah, you didn't tell me.
before I was assigned a particular plane. Those first 16 missions, I flew 9 different airplanes. It's whoever they tell you the plane you're going to fly, see. So in those 16 missions, I flew 9 planes.
Wow.
And you know how many of those 9 planes were lost during the time that I was flying missions?
How many?
8,
Oh,
when I wasn't on. So of that first 16 missions, I flew 9 planes, 8 of which were lost on missions when I wasn't on. And then I got my own airplane. They didn't say it's yours, but it turned out I was assigned that plane from then on. I flew 19 missions in one airplane and didn't lose it.
Wow.
Now, if you look at the statistical situation,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say the chances of me doing that would be?
Improbable.
Mm-hmm. Not.
I
Not
couldn't do
good.
it.
Yeah, I can't think it up right now, but not very good.
I'll tell you about a few other missions.
Okay.
We had one mission where we had a recall. That's what you really hated, a recall after you'd gotten up early in the morning, gotten in the plane,
Right.
take off. Of course, takeoff was hazardous. See, I didn't
Really?
mention that. Let me tell you about that. In an area of about 70 miles square, not square miles, 70 miles square, or maybe 65 by 50 or something like that. About as far as from here to the Georgia line on 85, and about as far as from here to the North Carolina on 26. There were 120 airfields.
Oh, wow.
Airplanes everywhere. The 8th Air Force, see, had 41 groups. Now, when you were taking off, you had airplanes everywhere. I was sparing a plane one day and wanted to carry it to another field, just 20 miles away,
Mm-hmm.
like 15 miles away. I took off, got up to a little altitude, and I saw the field. So I called him. I was coming in a certain runway. He said, what runway did you say? I told him. I said, aren't you the field with B-25 sitting at the pylon? He said, no, we're not a B-25 field. So I climbed up a little higher and I could see 6 airfields right there. So now when you start putting 2,000 planes in the air, all taking off at the same time, and in bad weather, what you do is you take off from your airfield, and you had a lead ship. They painted up. Some of them would paint them red or with dots, so you could tell it. That plane would go to a certain quadrant and circle, and the other planes that took off would go to that particular spot and get in formation, circling. Here come another plane get in. Here come another plane. It took about 45 minutes to get the group assembled. See, and then you're headed for Germany, falling into in combat line. So that was a very risky business. This one mission I started to tell you about, I was recalled after going through all that. We were over France, and I could see the track in front of me. When all of a sudden the plane started just vibrating like mad. I mean, it was just shaking. And my tail gunner called me and he said, sir, it looks like it's going to shake the tail off. It's vibrating so. Well, just before that, let me back up a minute. As we were flying along, the waist gunner called me and said, sir, can we have contrails from one engine? Well, of course you could. Contrails, you know, are formed from all engines. And I looked out and I saw contrails from my number 3 engine. Just as I saw it, the cowling was flying off. Well, I feathered the engine real quick, but then the airplane started shaking, just shaking like mad. And here we can see the target. And I thought, well, rather than trying to get further into Germany, it was during the Battle of the Bulge and it wasn't far into Germany, I better abort. So I started to turn, and it really, vibrated in. Well, I had to slow down. I had to slow that plane down to about 150 miles an hour.
Oh, God.
Barely turned. And then I couldn't hold my altitude. It was undercast below us. And I let down gradually, hoping I could stay above the undercast. And I was getting close to the English Channel. And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll drop below the clouds and salvo my bombs in the English Channel. I dropped down through the clouds. I never saw so many ships in my life. It looked like ships everywhere, Navy ships, various sizes. I didn't dare open those bomb bay doors. The Navy would shoot if a plane came close to them, no matter who it was. There wasn't any friend to foe with them.
Right.
I had my navigator firing the colors of the day, and we still kept losing altitude. I got down to about 2,000 feet and managed to hold that altitude till I got back to the field.
Wow.
And then I turned, since it's just me coming back, I turned for a long approach rather than coming in, hot line. And the tower let another B-17 pull out to take off ahead of me because I was taking such a long approach. And the joker pulled out and got his wheel off the runway and stuck. So there he is sitting blocking the runway I'm heading towards.
Oh, God.
I had to give those engines full power because I still had my bomb, hoping they wouldn't fail after being under stress all that time and go around. And by that time, they got the B-17 out of the way and I landed and tell the fellow at the tower what I thought about it. you had that sort of thing happen, see, it's not really part of combat.
Mm-hmm.
What had happened was the piston on the engine, you got a wrist pin, where the piston goes up and down on the shaft here. That bolt had come out of the wrist pin, so the piston had just shot right on out of the engine, so it knocked the cowling off.
Mm.
The cowling came back and hit underneath the elevator and ripped it about 6 feet long.
Wow.
And the air was catching that
Mm.
and just causing all this roughness. So you had those kind of things happen to you. Had
Mhm.
nothing to do.
Wow. So, did I hear that you said you saw a plane, two planes collide or something?
Yeah.
Mission number 9, what? Lazy
Was
Daisy.
that mission 9, Lazy Daisy? Well, on that mission, where was I going on that mission? Magdeburg.
Magdeburg, Germany.
Yeah.
September 28, 1944.
The way you got in position to take off is you had your little flimsy, they called it, that showed the 36 planes
Mm-hmm.
and where you were in the formation. You then taxi it out in order. The plane that if you were number 2 on this 3 group, this plane would taxi out, then this one, then the third one, then the next one. So you went in order. So you took off in order, made it easier to assemble. But Lazy Daisy came by me, a friend of mine flying, and I was right behind Lazy Daisy as we took off. Well, when we got to this target, as we approached Magdeburg, another group was coming towards the target. And so the 36 planes, the lead, the group leader,
Mm-hmm.
made a sharp turn to the right
To avoid the other planes?
to avoid this other group that was coming over.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm flying, here's the 3 planes, the leader and his 2. I'm flying, and these 3 planes up here,
Mm-hmm.
I'm the number 3 man. 1, 2, I'm right here. You can visualize these 3 up here. So he makes a sharp turn. Of course, we have to make a sharp turn. I glanced out and saw that the wingman opposite me was sliding towards me. And looked like he was going to slide right into me. So I pulled back on the stick and pulled up, and he slid under me. My ball turret gunner said it didn't look like it missed his tail more than that much, his tail.
Oh, my gosh.
He slid under me and right into the number 2 ship on the lead group. Right together. 2
Mm.
planes. Just a ball of fire.
Wow.
18 men.
Yeah.
Paris.
And of course that really shocked you. I dreamed about that night. I just saw them collide over and over. But to finish that story, I've got that in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And I found this woman I was telling you about, who was the daughter-in-law of a man in our squadron who went down, read this chapter. Other people read this chapter. I must have had 15 contacts I can show you. I got a book of people who contacted.
Wow.
One woman called me, contacted by email, and her
Father was, 3 people out of those 18 survived,
survived.
and her father survived.
Survived.
But
But he was
he'd
dead
been
now.
dead a long time, and she didn't know anything much about that.
So she came up here and brought 4 people with her and spent all day. I had a young boy contacted me from Chicago. His uncle was on that plane, and he never knew what happened.
Wow.
And he asked me all kind of questions. I got these emails.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just amazing what emails do as far as people contacting you on something like that.
Right. Well, that's...
I'll tell you about another mission, that what you got into separate from combat. We were on a mission and we got a recall, because the weather got bad
Mhm.
in England, real bad. And they were afraid they couldn't get the 8th Air Force back if they went through the whole mission, and it was right down on the ground.
Mhm.
So we came back, and we went over a buncher in England. A buncher is a non-directional radio range, just shoot straight up like that. So you can turn on it, and you've got an instrument in your plane with an arrow, it'll point to it. So if you're flying, that's the buncher. If it's pointing that way, it'll take you towards that buncher. If you're over there, wherever you are, it'll take you to the buncher. So our group was to go to buncher number 43. And then we were to peel off one at a time down through the overcast and go 43 miles to a British airfield. So we go over the buncher, and English weather was just levels of clouds. It wasn't any cumulus clouds.
Right.
But it was from about 2,000 feet down to the ground. It was
Mhm.
thick. So we came over the buncher, heading, they said, go 270 degrees for 43 miles. So we headed towards the buncher at 273, and one plane would peel off and go down. Next plane would peel off and go down, one behind the other and trail. So I started down through the overcast. And of course, we're close to the ground.
Mhm.
I'm telling everybody who knows to be on the lookout, make sure I don't run into something. We broke into the clear about 800 feet, just right on top of these churches.
Mhm.
And I'm flying along on this heading, and all of a sudden there's a clear area over here. I can see this airfield over there.
Mhm.
Didn't seem like it'd been quite 43 miles, but I wasn't going to take any chance. I could see that field. So I headed toward that field. And I could see the runway, but I didn't have a chance to get the exact heading of the runway. It closed in there. But what they would do is if that's the runway, and that's the way you should land, they'd put somebody at the end of the runway and shoot flares up through
Mhm.
this overcast. And the flare would pop, you'd know it at the end of the runway.
Right.
If you could come down right there, let down, you'd hit the runway.
Mhm.
Trouble, I didn't know the angle of the runway.
Hmm.
So I came back to where the flare was and let down. And when I came over the runway, I was at an angle about like that.
Oh God.
So I'd try to figure what the heading of the runway was, and I'd pull it up. I made 4 passes at that. The 4th time, I was halfway lined up with the runway. So I chopped all the power and sat down. And I looked, and it looked like the blooming end of the runway was practically on my nose. I sat down on the brakes, stopped before I got to the fence.
Mhm.
There's a big ditch outside. Took by that much of my tire out, off the tire tread, taxied back over, still had my bomb.
Wow.
Next plane managed to land. They taxied him over here, had a little follow me car. Next guy comes in, goes clean through the fence, into the ditch, tore the plane up.
Oh gosh.
Next plane came in. When they were bringing him back, they let him get his wheel off the runway this little far, and he got stuck with the tail sitting out the run. Had to shut the field down
No.
the next day. And it was a fighter field, 3,000-foot runway. We had 6,000. So all of us had landed, about 5 or 6 of us, on a 3,000-foot runway when we couldn't see it. And this colonel there was livid because his field was shut down the whole next day. He couldn't fly. So that was no mission credit.
Oh right, but that was
It was
scary.
worse than a mission.
Mhm.
Let's see what else.
I got a question about you bombing one of Henry Ford's plants in Cologne.
Yeah.
I find that very unusual that the U.S. would be bombing.
Well, they would turn out German products.
Right.
They turned out tanks.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. So they took over everything.
It was no longer Henry
if you know that that's the greatest battle the United States has ever been involved in, as far as the number of troops.
Mm-hmm.
It's always been a mystery to me how it happened. You see, the Germans had attacked through the Ardennes
Right.
and surprised the French and British. The reason they were able to defeat the French so quick. They didn't expect them to come through that. They built a Maginot Line almost to Belgium,
Mm-hmm.
and their plan was to bring the French and British troops to the undefended part from the Maginot Line to the sea, except the Ardennes were so heavily forested and ditches that they said
Right.
nobody could come through that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly where the Germans came. So what did we do? After we moved across France, they decided that Montgomery were attacking the north, Patton in the south,
Mm-hmm.
and the Ardennes is used as a rest place. They said the Germans won't come through here.
Yeah.
Certainly. And they didn't have many troops, but for rest place. And so where did the Germans hit? They hit in the Ardennes.
Mm-hmm.
There was 50,000 casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. That was more than was lost in any other American battle in history.
Wow.
And you don't hear much about it.
Mm-mm.
Well, when that battle started, everybody was saying the war's going to be over pretty quick. It was getting towards Christmas. And I think it started about the 16th of December, something like that. And the Germans were smart enough to pick a time when you had real bad weather,
Mm-hmm.
so you couldn't have air support. And they attacked, and their plan was to swing to the right and go towards Antwerp to the sea and cut the two armies together,
Right.
Montgomery to the north and the
Mhm.
Patton to the south. So they alerted us, once that battle started, we got up and went out and got in our plane, and we'd sit there for 2 hours. It was right down to the ground,
Mm-hmm.
bad weather. And after about 2 hours, they'd shoot a red flare, and we'd get out and aborted the mission.
And y'all had to do that every day for a while, right?
We did that for 3 straight days.
Mm.
We get up early, get briefed as to where we were going, what we were going to bomb, all the details like any mission. And of course, then we were, in that area, we were bombing road junctures,
Mm-hmm.
bridges, anything to support the troops.
Right.
Third day, I guess it was, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Next day we go out there, the day before Christmas, General Doolittle sends a field order down. Says the 8th Air Force will be dispatched today no matter what the weather is.
Mm.
Is that critical? So we go out there and get in our plane, and when I taxied out to the, like I told you, taxi out in order.
Mhm.
So you lined up as you go onto the runway, and one at a time you turn on the runway and take off in 30-second intervals.
Right.
All I could see of the plane in front of me was the tail.
Oh my
I
God.
couldn't see the wings. And I turned over the runway and took off. And we got up and assembled. You know how many planes there were on that mission?
How many?
2,045 4-engine bombers.
Mm.
That was the biggest bomber stream, order of battle they called it,
Mm-hmm.
in the whole war.
And did y'all go bomb around Bastogne or?
Yeah, I bombed St. Vith,
Mm-hmm.
S-T-V-I-T-H. My roommate was on the ground, my college roommate.
Mm-hmm.
He was in the engineers on the ground. And he told me, he said, I have never seen anything like that. All those contrails are 2,000 planes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, didn't the sky clear up on that day actually?
Oh, yeah, once we got close to the front
Mhm.
lines over France, it was clear as a bell. Leaving England and all, it was terrible.
Right.
But But he said that was the most beautiful sight he ever saw.
Mhm.
And I've got a book up here about, and talks about the Battle of the Bulge, and that chapter, you know what the title of that chapter is?
What?
The War's Most Beautiful Morning.
Mhm.
You can imagine how you'd felt if you were on the ground.
No, yes, sir. Because y'all saved a lot of those troops from being completely destroyed. So that is amazing. So.
Well, to get 35 missions, you just assumed that you probably wouldn't make it.
Right.
Some people often ask me, weren't you afraid of this and afraid? Of course, you didn't like being shot at,
Mhm.
but you just assumed it was going to hit somebody else.
Right.
You assumed probably you wouldn't make it, but do the best you can.
Mhm.
And it was an unusual situation to be in. I flew my 21st mission on my 21st birthday. Almost.
Wow.
I wrote my parents that day. You couldn't say anything, so I said my missions are close to this day. I thought you could read that.
Mhm.
Some people had code they would use, so
Right.
we had to censor all of our men's mail. The
Mhm.
officer censored the enlisted men. And it was kind of bad, a lot of it was personal, man
Right.
and wife, but you had to read it, and then you had to put sign a signature that's been censored.
Mhm.
And that's the biggest change I think I can see in the world today, is how people then kept secrets. The British people, the people that were working on things like Ultra, where
Mhm.
they broke the German code, they kept that a secret the whole war.
That's
And
crazy.
American people, man, if you said things that you weren't supposed to say, people jumped on you. It was a completely different society
Mhm.
as far as being unified and knowing that what we've got to do is for the better of everybody, not for myself.
Mhm.
And I like the British people. They went through real hard times.
Mhm.
They used to have dances at the base, maybe. As the group was stood down, I never did learn to dance. The girl I was going with in high school was a preacher's daughter and didn't dance, so I never did. So I didn't participate. My
Mhm.
wife would be glad to know. But they'd take trucks into town, and all these English girls would just jump at the opportunity to come out because you had good food they
Mhm.
couldn't buy,
Right.
and have a great time. English family would invite you to eat, even though they didn't have much to eat themselves. And it was interesting getting to know them.
Right.
The way we got around over there was on bicycles. You bought a bicycle. And I paid about £10 for it. That's another thing that's lost over there that's real picturesque. In those days, the money was so different.
Mhm.
You had a pound, you had a shilling,
Right.
pence, and a pound was like equal to $4.50, and a shilling was like, you had to learn all that. And of
Mhm.
course, to start with, you didn't have the vaguest idea. You just hold out some money to
And
them.
they just take
They
it.
take it and give you back what you're supposed to
Yes,
have.
sir.
But you finally learned how to use their money,
Mhm.
and the accents. They were all real friendly, but about halfway through our tour, we got what's called a rest leave at a flak house.
Mhm.
The reason they called it a flak house was just something we called it. You flak happy, so you need a rest. And they would take these English mansions
Mhm.
and take them over. And I went to a place called Fursdown, down southwest of England. Beautiful place. They gave you civilian clothes to put on. They brought you orange juice in bed. You felt like things you wouldn't be able to do in civilian life. You were
Right.
a real king. We go out and play softball and shoot archery
Mhm.
at the rest home. Stayed there a week. And they carried you down to various places, carried us to a cathedral, had a big table that supposedly was the round table of King Arthur,
Mhm.
carried us to a football game down at the Birmingham that the American troops were playing. Then you had to go back. And one sad thing is the boy who flew me down there and also flew down and got us to fly back to the group. He flew a mission while I was down there. And then when I got back, he was on my wing. I forgot to tell you about this. On this mission, worst mission in the war, right here. I was leading the little group. He was on my left wing. Got a direct hit. Plane blew up. And you know, I just been flying with him the day before.
Right.
It was just his third mission or something like that. My wife and I went back to England in 1985. And I had a 8th Air Force cap on. And you'd be surprised. The people on the subway in London, how many people would speak to you? They'd say, Colonel, what group were you in? So forth. Just as friendly as they could be. And we went back to the 384th Bomb Group field. There's nothing there now, just the remains of the runway, except a monument. Monument to the 384. And you know what the English people do? They put flowers on that monument every year.
Wow.
Which I don't know if people in this country would do that.
I know. It's sad too.
They were great people. And,
well, thank you so much for this interview, Colonel Story. You look good.
I've enjoyed it.
Yes, sir.
Hope you do a great job for Clemson.
Yes, sir. Well, you are. Did you